And this is a really nice stage that you set, Alaric, the fact that how challenging these, the lives of these forest-dwelling communities have been over past few years, or rather, for centuries now. And why I say that, it's interesting, or it sets a really interesting stage for me, it's because I worked in the central Himalayan region, more specifically in the state of Uttarakhand, which is my home state. And this is relatively a new state, and it was formed in the year 2000. And the reason why it was formed was that it was part of this huge state called Uttar Pradesh. And the people in the mountainous region, they felt underrepresented, and their issues were kind of underrepresented. They were not adequately addressed, especially when all these policy making processes and these decisions were happening in the capital of the state, in the Lucknow, which was in the plains further south. So since these people in the mountains, they were feeling this sense of political isolation, they started demanding for a separate state. And in order to do that, there was these series of protests, rallies, and curfews. And so over a period of time, these curfews, rallies, and protests, they happened. And eventually, in November 2000, this newly formed state, it was carved out from the pre-existing state of Uttar Pradesh. And I still remember, I have been a witness of this separation back in 2000, and I remember that there were these times when we had week-long curfews and red alerts. And I remember how my parents were worried about whether we had enough food for the family, because you couldn't get out of your house that time during the curfew. So it was a really interesting time. And then it was a great privilege for me to go back to my home state, not just home country, but also home state, to conduct some really interesting research over there. So as the title indicates, I worked on the common pool resources. And these common pool resources are kind of funny. Why I say funny is because these resources, nobody holds an executive title to these resources, yet you have all these different peoples who claim that they have an ownership. So that makes these, management, the whole management process of these resources kind of funny, although very challenging. But I find it funny that how all these stakeholders kind of claiming their ownership. So broadly, these common pool resources, they have two attributes. One is the aspect of subtractability. That's really the exploitation by one user kind of reduces the resource availability for other users. For example, the fish I catch, you can't. And the other aspect or the attribute of the common pool resources is that of excludability, where it's really difficult for the reason where there are multiple users and multiple stakeholders, and there's fuzzy property rights. It's really difficult to exclude the beneficiaries. So both these attributes, subtractability and excludability, kind of characterizes common pool resources. So going back and kind of the history of how the CPR scholarship, I would be using, I just want to make a side note that I will be using the term CPR for common pool resource. So please don't get confused. If I'm saying CPR, that does not mean that somebody is giving a CPR. It's just that I'm using it interchangeably with common pool resources. So going back a little bit history, how many of you have read Tragedy of the Commons? It's a very popular article, kind of serves as a seminal article, and it was written by a microbiologist called Garrett Hardin, and he wrote it back in 1968. And basically in that article, he was postulating that all individuals are rational individuals, and we will all, in the process of maximizing our profits, we would all overexploit resources, overharvest resources, and eventually that will lead to collapse, hence the tragedy. So that was broadly what Garrett Hardin's argument was. However, Eleanor Ostrom, who is the leader of the CPR scholarship, Eleanor Ostrom and her colleagues, they, on the basis of some of the empirical evidence that they were able to gather from places all over the world, they were able to show that what Garrett Hardin was saying was not entirely right. And they were able to say that because in their data, they saw that there were communities who were able to organize themselves and organize themselves in a way that they were able to manage the resources effectively. So on the basis of these evidences, they put together the work, all these case studies, into one book called The Drama of the Commons, which was published in 2002, hence the title. So the title of this book kind of inspires the topic of my talk. And why it's called Drama of Commons is because this entire scenario of common pool resource management does not only have tragedy, but it also has some happy cases where these communities have been able to manage their resources successfully by organizing themselves. So going back to India, as I told at the beginning of my talk, that I worked in the central Himalayan region, and I focused on this really interesting traditional forest managing institution called the Van Panchayats. Now these Van Panchayats are almost 8 decades long. So when I was reading about Van Panchayats, what was really striking to me was that the fact that these institutions are 8 decades long, what are the factors that have really kept them going or sustained these institutions? So that was like a long-standing question that I had. But then going into the field, there were like other set of questions that kind of got added, and some more specific questions that were compiled into my list. So anyway, these are very democratic institutions, and the members of these institutions are nominated and elected by the members of the community by show of hand. There's a date on which all these villagers are asked to assemble together, and then they nominate their members, and then by show of hand they end up electing the members, and hence the Van Panchayat committee is formed. And so initially these committees are very effective, and they form rules, and not only that they form rules, but then they also are actively engaged in making sure that those rules are enforced. And it's really interesting that it started off with just a handful of Van Panchayats, but in today's time there are over 12,000 Van Panchayats, which is pretty remarkable. And it's interesting, when I was doing my fieldwork, I was talking to a bureaucrat who was very instrumental in upping this number of Van Panchayats, and I said that it's clearly it's not that all the Van Panchayats are very effective and they're doing a great job. There are so many cases of Van Panchayats that are defunct, that they are not doing a good job. But then his reason was that the fact that he was able to up this number, that this region or this institution received not just national attention but also international attention, which kind of made sense. But now this bureaucrat, he has retired, and he's actively engaged with an NGO in the region, and they're focusing on strengthening these Van Panchayats, working with these Van Panchayats and figuring out a way to strengthen these Van Panchayats. So I used a mixed method approach. I did a lot of ethnographic study, and conducted semi-structured interviews, and I interacted with NGO personnel and village community members, the Van Panchayat members, and the elderly members, and some social activists who were there in the region, and also some of the independent researchers. It was really interesting. And then I also participated in some of the meetings and organized some focus group discussions. And I think the most interesting, although all these different methods that I adopted for collecting my data was very useful and was very valuable, but one that was very close to my heart was participant observation, where I would pretty much be like a fly on the wall and just observe and take it all in. And that happened during meetings, and I also did a lot of homestays. And in that process, and that was a great process for me to sort of blend in and really get that hands-on experience of how things are for these communities. And I was solely throughout my fieldwork, which was about for a year and a half, I was just living with these communities, trying to adapting my way with theirs, and like, you know, just doing what they were doing, getting in the morning, going getting wood from the forest, and you know, the way they cooked their food. So really like blending in, and that was primarily because of my intention to be able to relate with these communities, because as environmentalists, you know, the way the preaching is done, like, you know, the act of resource exploitation is always seen as bad. It's bad. Like, you know, the fact that these communities are extracting for fuel wood or other resources from the forest, it's bad. So my idea behind doing a lot of these like homestays was to remove that bias and sort of like, you know, be as unbiased as I possibly could. And then, you know, this process also required a lot of like rapport building, because it's not easy for an outsider to just like go into a rural setting and pretend as if they know everything. And so it took some time. It took some time for me to sort of like, you know, not just me to get comfortable, but also for people to be comfortable in my presence. So this, the top newspaper cutting is from a workshop that I attended with one panchayat sarpanches, the one panchayat leaders. And it was again a great process where I was working on one-on-one basis with these one panchayat leaders. So it was a great process. And you know, starting out, my objective or my goal was to focus on the institutional diversity and how these one panchayats, they work in diverse institutional setups. So again, like, you know, going back, I was able to shortlist. So out of all these like 12,000 one panchayats, I was able to shortlist 41 panchayats in Nainital district, and based on, since I was focusing on the institutional diversity, based on, you know, the criteria that I had developed from my study, I was able to zero down on 12 different one panchayats. And all these 12 different one panchayats, they had different, and when I say institutional setup, I'm referring to the collaborators with whom these one panchayats are working, whether it's like government or NGOs. And then NGOs, as you will see later in my talk, that the NGOs, they play a very crucial role, especially in that geographical context where I was working. So I was able to choose these 12 different one panchayats, and based on their institutional configuration, I was able to put them into 3 different categories: type 1, type 2, and type 3, where type 1 included one panchayats that were closely working in collaboration with the local NGOs, the user group committees, and the government. And these user group committees are basically very informal groups which comprise of women. They're just like group of women who get together and they discuss about, like, you know, the issues in the forest and how could they possibly address those. So they form a very instrumental part of these one panchayats, and they directly support one panchayats. And then type 2 included the one panchayats that did not really have a very strong backing of user group, but then they had some support of NGOs and the government. And type 3 was the one panchayat that was working entirely with the government. And it was so although these institutions are claimed to be decentralized, but the reality is that it's not entirely decentralized. I mean, there's always some sort of like role of government, good or bad. It's always there. And so decentralized, to say, like, you know, that these institutions are decentralized is somewhat misleading, because I don't think these institutions are entirely decentralized. So common pool resource scholarship, like, you know, all these scholars, all this while, they have been engaged in creating this like database, or sort of like an inventory of all the factors that contribute to effective forest management. And out of all these factors, enforcement has been seen as a very important variable. And so there have been like these long-term multi-scale studies comparing diverse ecologies and countries that suggest that, you know, how enforcement is a critical variable. And by enforcement, you know, these CPR scholars basically mean monitoring and sanctioning, the process of doing monitoring and sanctioning. So there's like, you know, large area of study. And for me, Coleman, 2009, Coleman's article, so Eric Coleman, he is an economist. His article, I remember reading his article way back when it was published, and it was very, I I mean, I was really influenced by that article primarily because, through his analysis, he was able to show that how monitoring and sanctioning contributed to vegetation diversity, composition, and structure. And that was really fascinating for me because that he was able to connect economics with ecology and was able to show such a direct relation. So that's how it got started. So I sort of was able to just focus on enforcement. I just hung on to this variable, and since it was already established as a salient variable, I managed to I decided to sort of just focus on it. So as I was saying, that monitoring sort of it means enforcement basically means monitoring and sanctioning, where monitoring is just about it's an act of watching, observing, or doing an assessment, and sanctioning is an act of penalizing the rule breakers, either in the form of imposing fines or legal sanctions. And there have been a lot of studies that have sort of figured out in what way enforcement or monitoring and sanctioning should be carried out. They talk about how locally based monitoring and sanctioning is important. They talk about how the monitoring and sanctioning should be nested, and there have been studies that have highlighted the role of external factors like the NGOs and the government. So taking into account all these different studies, I formulated these research questions. So in today's talk, I'll be focusing on these 4 research questions. And the first one kind of was just looking into the causal process of monitoring and sanctioning, which was to just see how do these rules emerge, and eventually how is monitoring and sanctioning structured in these Van Panchayats. So these are very specific questions that I was focusing. And then my second question was looking at the challenges of carrying out monitoring and sanctioning in the Van Panchayats. The third one was to see what factors promote carrying out CPR monitoring and sanctioning. And the fourth question was eventually focusing on the role of external factors. So when I was looking at the emergence of monitoring and sanctioning, I observed that there was this intermixing of the levels. So these rules, they emerge at 3 levels: constitutional, collective, and operational. And there was this intermixing of levels that was happening when the emergence of rule was taking place. And I was also able to observe that the de jure rule, so there's already, since these Van Panchayats are legal institutions, there we have a Van Panchayat Niyamavali, which is a Van Panchayat rule book. It's a legal rule book that already exists. So, but then in my analysis, I was able to see that these Van Panchayats, although they are aware of the Van Panchayat, the formal rules, they develop their own rules. They have their own de facto rules, and it makes sense because you cannot generalize all these formal rules across the different case studies. However, it was interesting for me to see how much overlap there was between de jure and de facto rules, and I was able to do that by looking at the emergence of monitoring and sanctioning rules. And I was able to find that when it comes to monitoring, the way it was organized was that it was either mutual monitoring or third-party monitoring. And in mutual monitoring, what was happening was that what was happening was that these individuals or the families, they mutually sort of decided who's going to assume the responsibility of conducting the monitoring duties. And what made third-party sort of different or unique from mutual monitoring was that third-party monitoring was sort of a setup where there were these specialized guards that were hired, and these guards could either be forest guards or people from the community, and these people were paid. These guards were paid. However, and then moving on to sanctioning, when it came to sanctioning, the approach that was followed by both these methods was pretty much the same. Initially, it was graduated sanctioning, where these rule offenders were given warnings, and then if based on the seriousness of their offense, they were it was decided whether they have to be legally sanctioned or have to pay a higher monetary penalty. So does that make sense? Please feel free to raise your hand in case if there's anything that is not clear. If you have any question, I'm more than happy to keep it interactive as I go. So this is not to kind of overwhelm you, but then just to kind of show that when I was collecting my data, I was able to find all these different factors that both facilitated as well as impeded enforcement process, and then I was able to put them all together, and in my analysis I color-coded them. So the red are the factors that were reported the highest frequency. So like a lot of people, they said that how they thought that monitoring and sanctioning is important because that is these forests are important for agriculture, because these are mostly like farm-based communities. So forests are important for agriculture, and that's why it's important. So so the red data over there that you see are the ones that was like most reported, and then followed by green and yellow and the aqua and pink. So and then I like broke down that data into 2 chunks. And so my second question was focusing on the challenges of CPR monitoring and sanctioning in the one panchayats. And again, like there's sort of like a different, like a huge list of factors that these communities felt kind of like imposed challenges in the enforcement process. However, I mean, some said that it's time consuming, and they said like they reported about like lack of clear boundaries that was making it very challenging, and that people don't pay fines. There was lack of training. Also, there was threat from wildlife. Like these guards, basically, these guards who are guarding or monitoring the forests of India or the forests of Uttarakhand that I'm talking about, they are unlike any guards that you would find here. They are people who literally like patrol in the forest with a bamboo stick. So I mean, there's this literally like no motivation at all. Like after a point of time, you lose that motivation because it's just so time consuming, and it's very draining, and it's not efficient at all, because like although you're investing so much time and energy, I mean, if you are like in one corner of the forest, there might be somebody else like extracting resource at the other corner. So overall, like monitoring is a very challenging process. However, what was in my data, what was really interesting was this variable of social pressure. And why it was interesting, because a lot of common pool resource scholarship says that if the group size is small, that would make effective, that will lead to like effective enforcement or lead to effective forest governance. However, that was clearly not the case in my case study, at least, because a lot of people, a lot of these guards were reporting that because of social pressure, they were not able to report these offenses. And social pressure, by what I mean is that like these are close-knit communities, and people were either family or friends, and they were just not comfortable at complaining about their family or friends violating the rules, because obviously they don't want to spoil their relationship. So
what's the type 1, 2, and 3?
So type 1, 2, these are the institutional setups. So type 1 is the one, they are the one panchayats that are working in close collaboration with user group committees, NGOs, and the government. And so I talked about it. So I wish I could like get into the details of like why it differs in different types, but we won't have much time. But then I just want to like draw your attention to this like social pressure variable, because it's like completely opposite to what the CPR scholarship kind of establishes, which says that in smaller community there's higher transparency, there's higher accountability, which would like directly translate to effective enforcement and effective forest governance. However, that was not really the case in my case study, because of the smaller size and because of transparency, there was higher social pressure. So these people were not able to report the offenses. Hence, these there was this increased violation of the rules that was happening, because people didn't care about the rules, like complying to those rules. And then looking at the factors that promoted CPR monitoring and sanctioning, again, like I was able to find all these like different variables, like sustaining agriculture, like how these forests are important for sustaining agriculture for future generation, and preserving water sources, so on and so forth. But then again, in this whole analysis, one variable that really drew my attention was that of protecting plantation. And again, in the field side, I was able to notice that a lot of these communities that were engaged in afforestation activities, their sense of attachment to the forest, it increased by like 2 times, 3 times, and that happened purely because of all the efforts that they had put into carrying out afforestation activities. And usually these villagers would be a little lax about letting their cattle graze in the forest, but then when they knew that the cattle was kind of closer to the area where they had been doing their afforestation activity at, so they would make sure that they ward off the cattle. And so afforestation is something that has been going on for a very long time in the area, and there are people who are very proud of all these forests that they have successfully managed. And I remember when I was doing my field study when I was back in India, there were villagers who would literally take me by my hand and show me the site where they had collectively worked together in regenerating, and they were really proud of those areas. So this is a photograph of one of those sites, and this is hardly an 8 or 10-year-old forest. But then they were able to show me that how this was a land, this was a patch of land that was completely degraded, and how with collective action and collective afforestation activity they were able to regenerate. So there was this sense of pride that was seen. And the other variable that was important, again from theoretical standpoint, was monitoring reward. Going back to CPR scholarship again, when it talks about sanctioning, the sanctioning is mostly negative sanctioning. How punishment and penalties are important. But there's not much literature or writing that has been done on positive sanctioning, that how rewards and positive sanctioning is an important variable. So my colleague at Ohio State, her and I, we kind of put together these results, and we have made a case for positive sanctioning or rewards as an important variable in effective forest management, especially at the local level. So the last question was that of the role of external factors. And again, in the first 3 questions, we were mostly focusing on the locally based monitoring and sanctioning efforts. But then it was inevitable for me to not notice the role that the NGOs and the government agencies they play in the site where I was working. So Thomas Coons, he was my dissertation advisor. He had developed this governmental impacts framework back in 2004 with his colleagues, and so we decided to use this framework for my study, and we extended the use of this governmental impacts framework to also include the role of NGOs, because you were able to see that both government and NGOs, they played an important role. And although it was different, it's not fair for me to say that they sort of have an equal contribution. They play a different role. They have different impacts. But then we were able to see through our analysis that the government, both the government and the NGOs, they have substantial impact on issue definition, resource distribution, and providing resources, and also a structure and decision-making process. So overall, all these interactions kind of contributed to the forest governance. And so it was clear, initially, again, this was about scaling up some of the lessons of common pool scholarship, which mostly highlighted that how important local effort is, and that these communities are able to organize themselves and engage in all these enforcement activities. But at the same time, we were making a case that, especially using the example of my case study, that pure self-governance is probably not a reality. And we were able to do that by showing that how these government and NGOs, especially, again, I wouldn't say that that these governments and NGOs are gods and they are always doing good for these communities, but so I was able to see both negatives and the positive. But for me, it was interesting to see that how the role of government and the NGOs kind of stimulated the collective action. Otherwise, it was like a very monotonous. There was a monotony that was seen in the Van Panchayats that were completely neglected and had no collaboration with any of the stakeholders. However, these external factors, they were playing a very crucial role in stimulating the collective action process, and the impact of government and the NGOs were seen to be very interactive. And especially, again, using my case study as an example, I was able to see that how these NGOs kind of acted as the middle person who connected the government and the communities together. And not only were these external factors were successful in mobilizing the resources, but because of their actions, they were also able to mobilize the community. So just to kind of reflect on from where we started. So we were focusing on these Van Panchayats, a very specific context. But then it's interesting to see how these local efforts, they have global impacts, and I can say that by way of using these examples of these international efforts that are being made, focusing just on decentralization. We have RED programs, and we have again going back to India, the Joint Forest Management Scheme, Green India Mission, and now we have this compensatory afforestation management planning authority, and it has been in news a lot lately because that has brought about $3 billion just for afforestation activities. And again, these are not the best solutions. There are challenges that are associated with it. But it's interesting to see how these decentralization efforts or decentralized work is receiving a lot of attention, not just locally but also globally. And to kind of reiterate, the fact that I chose enforcement or monitoring and sanctioning was not just intellectual curiosity for me. I feel that the success of collaborative natural resource management requires identification and better understanding of such specific factors, and we should not undermine the importance of such factors. And again, by way of